A lot of people are tempted to get an RTX 4060, but they see that it's almost $300 and you're only getting 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So wouldn't it be nice if you get something closer to $200 and get a very similar experience? Well, that's what we're exploring in this video as we compare AMD's RX 6650 XT up against the RTX 4060. They're both 8 gigabyte graphics cards, and the 6650 is coming from previous generation. However, in the United States, you can get them as low as $219, and it's been available at that price off and on for months now. Now, the RTX 4060, on the other hand, has come down since its original launch price of $300, but the cheapest models are currently available for about $275, and more frequently they're closer to $300. But we're right around Prime Day when I'm filming this, so we got a little bit of discounts, a bit more than usual as I'm filming. Now, the 4060 I'm testing out in this video is the Asus Dual, and the 6650 XT I'm testing out in this video is the ASRock Challenger. And these are both running at their out-of-the-box settings, although I do have smart access memory and ResizeBAR support enabled on the AM5 platform that I'm using. Full test system specs are in the video description. And what are we gonna be testing? We're gonna be looking at 1080p and 1440p, but we're not just gonna run max settings and away we go. We're going to test max settings, but we're also gonna test out lower settings, upscaling, all of that to get an idea of how these GPUs would actually hold up in the latest titles at settings you might actually use. Now here in Ghost of Tsushima, you might notice at 1080p very high settings, both GPUs are doing well, but the 6650 XT actually has the edge by 6% at 73 FPS versus 69. Nice. If we drop the, I can't speak. If we drop the settings down to high, we see that frame rates bump all the way up to 93 FPS and 87 respectively, giving the 6650 XT the edge by 7% in the averages. And actually, if you check the 1% lows, we're getting an 18% lead at 84 versus 71. So things are looking pretty good at the start here for the 6650 XT. But wait, something changed. Let's pause and talk about it. Suddenly at 1440p very high settings, we're noticing that the 6650's XT's lead has vanished, and now the 4060 is winning by 32% and 41% in the 1% lows. What is happening here? Well, I was looking into what could be causing the unusual result, and I'm also seeing some little stutters on the frame time graph here on the 6650 XT. And then I looked a little deeper at these stats here. Notice the system RAM usage. So that's not VRAM, that's system RAM. But if your game is trying to use more information than can fit in your VRAM buffer, sometimes it has to spill that information into system memory, and accessing that is slower, which can slow down your performance. And I'm noticing that system RAM, this is the per process usage, is a few gigabytes higher here on the 6650 XT than it is on the 4060. And that's indicating to me, along with the performance difference, that the 6650 XT is likely spilling over VRAM, having to access system memory at these settings and slowing things down, whereas the 4060 either isn't having those issues or not to the same extent. Now, why would that be possible if they're both 8 gigabyte graphics cards, which they are? Well, AMD and Nvidia don't actually always use the exact same amount of VRAM when doing exactly the same thing in games, because they run a different software stack, and there's different designs and different differences in compression. And I've shown in other videos where I looked at this more in detail and in a wider variety of games that it seems like Nvidia is usually just using a bit less VRAM. So if you were right on that 8 gigabyte borderline, it's possible that this is one of those edge cases where it's just enough to push the 6650 XT over the edge, whereas the 4060 is still okay. However, are these actually the performance numbers you'd be using anyway? Meaning, I'm not sure how relevant it is when we're not at graphics settings that we would actually choose to use, given that even the 4060 is only hitting 49 FPS here, when if we did something like, I don't know, enable DLSS quality and FSR quality, performance goes up noticeably. Although the 4060 still has a 20% advantage here, and we're still showing a little more, system RAM usage on the AMD side, so it's possible we're still having a bit of problems even at these settings. Here we're seeing 71 FPS versus 59, 20% advantage for the 4060, and a 25% lead in the 1% lows at 64 versus 51. Now, I also decided to kick on frame generation, and we should stop here and talk a little bit about this because this is one of the games that has FSR 3.1, which means we can use not only use frame generation on the AMD GPU, but we could also, if we wanted to, enable it with other upscalers like DLSS. The 4060 could use FSR 3 upscaling here, and we're actually going to do that in a minute. Because notice that with frame generation enabled, which to be clear is kind of a frame interpolation, it doesn't make the game more responsive and it can have some image quality issues, but it does increase the motion fluidity on your screen. But the 4060 wasn't really boosting in frame rate here, whereas the 6650 XT was, giving it a 35% performance edge here in terms of frame rate. So what do I think is happening with this? Well, based on other testing I've done, I feel like DLSS 3 frame generation, which the 4060 is using, is a bit more sensitive to when it runs over into VRAM issues, or maybe it uses more VRAM than FSR 3 does. And can cause some performance concerns on the 8GB cards when they spill over here. And so I actually think that's what's happening here, whereas FSR 3 is not showing as much of an issue with that on the 6650 XT. So all sorts of interesting edge case VRAM situations on these 8GB graphics cards, which shows that, why a lot of people aren't super happy with 8GB right now. But what are we doing now? Now we're running FSR 3 frame generation on both GPUs, despite the underlying upscaler being different. We're using FSR and DLSS quality upscaling with FSR 3 frame generation on both graphics cards, including the 4060. And now we see the 4060 is getting the frame interpolation going and takes a overall frame rate lead by 14%. Anyway, kind of interesting stuff. However, if we go down to the high settings, it seems like all of the VRAM issues are wiped out on both cards, and our performance numbers here are good on both. Slight edge for the 6650 XT at 62 FPS versus 60. That's a 3% advantage. Although the 1% lows are a bit larger lead at 55 versus 51, giving an 8% advantage to the 6650 XT at these settings. Now, you could use upscaling off of the high settings as a baseline, and now we're getting into pretty nice high frame rate territory at 87 versus 89. Now it's the 4060 taking a 2% lead. However, in the 1% lows, the 6650 XT still has the lead by 5% at 79 versus 75. I'd call it performance-wise basically a tie here, although I would give a slight image quality edge to DLSS, although I think this is one of the better looking games as far as FSR goes. Let's move on to some Unreal Engine 5 testing. This is Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga, which is probably the biggest visual showcase for Unreal Engine 5 at this point. And at 1080p high settings, which is the highest preset, neither GPU is doing great. It's 43 versus 38, 13% lead for the 4060. Although, to be honest, in this slow-paced of a game, this could be fine. But in other Unreal Engine 5 games, you'd certainly want to chase a higher frame rate. Now, Unreal Engine 5 tends to boost performance significantly with upscaling, and on the AMD GPU, I'm choosing to use Unreal Engine 5's built-in TSR upscaler, which I think looks better than FSR in most games I've tested. We're sticking to using DLSS on the 4060, and we're getting 61 versus 55 FPS, 11% lead for the 4060, and a 6% lead in the 1% lows at 52 versus 49. Another way to get almost exactly the same frame rate, but to stay at the native 1080p resolution, would be to use medium settings at 1080p. Sounds like my kids are running around on the floor upstairs. Tried to film this while they were sitting down snacking, but maybe they didn't stay seated long enough. Anyway, 1080p medium settings get us 60 versus 55 FPS, 9% lead for the 4060, and a 4% lead in the 1% lows at 51 versus 49. You could go all the way down to the low settings, and now you'd have 71 FPS on the RTX 4060, and the 6650 XT has 65, giving a 9% lead to the Nvidia GPU, and a 2 FPS lead in the 1% lows, which translates to about a 4% advantage. Those are the 1080p low settings, and that is native resolution. While they're low, I mean, honestly, if you just look at it, they still look quite good. But what if we moved up to 1440p? At 1440p high settings, which is the maximum settings in the game, this is another case where I'm wondering if maybe something VRAM related is involved, because the 6650 XT is way further back in performance than the 4060 and way off of what we expect based on the other tests we ran, even in this game at 1080p, with a 43% lead for the 4060. However, even the 4060 wasn't getting great performance there. And if you upscale at using TSR and DLSS at the quality setting, and now the performance gap closes quite a bit, although the 4060 still takes a 15% lead at 47 versus 41, and an 11% lead in the 1% lows at 41 versus 37. And again, I'd give a small image quality edge to DLSS here, although I do think TSR quality at 1440p does look pretty good here. 1440p medium settings native resolution, we hit 43 FPS on the RTX 4060, giving it a 13% advantage over the 38 frames per second we're getting on that 6650 XT. It's a 9% lead in the 1% lows at 37 versus 34. Now, this is native resolution at 1440p, so that gives this the opportunity to use upscaling to now push us near 60 FPS on both GPUs. With TSR and DLSS quality upscaling on the medium settings, things look pretty good, and the 6650 XT is reaching 59 FPS average in this scene, whereas the 4060 hits 65, giving it a 10% lead, and a 2% lead in the 1% lows at 54 versus 53. So both GPUs actually able to get a decent experience around 60 FPS in this game on a 1440p display, which is pretty cool. If you want to stick to native resolution, you could go down to the low settings, but the low settings can't reach 60 FPS on these GPUs at 1440p. We're hitting 49 and 43 FPS, respectively, giving a 14% advantage to the RTX 4060. The 1% lows are a bit tighter at 5% lead for the 4060 at 41 FPS versus 39. Now, you could use the low settings as the base from which to upscale, and again, using TSR and DLSS at the quality setting now gets us a pretty smooth frame rate at 71 and 76 respectively, giving a 7% advantage to the RTX 4060. The 1% lows are 63 versus 62, which is a 2% lead for the 4060. And again, some image quality differences between TSR and DLSS upscaling. Let's take a look at Horizon Forbidden West, which at 1080p very high settings, I believe we're also seeing some VRAM issues. This time, the 4060 takes a 28% lead in the average frame rate, but the 6650 XT takes a 41% lead in the 1% lows. In other words, we're seeing more stutters on the frame time graph, actually on the 4060 with some larger stutters here. And fewer stutters, but they're still there on the 6650 XT. In other words, those probably aren't the settings you should use because it's inconsistent frame times. And if we dial back to the high settings, the VRAM comes a lot more under control, and it's now a 9% lead for the 4060 in the averages at 70 versus 64, and a 21% lead in the 1% lows at 58 versus 48, indicating that perhaps in the 1% lows, we're seeing a bit more of those edge case 8GB VRAM issues on the AMD graphics card again. However, if we go down to the medium settings, we're definitely not seeing anything VRAM related pop up on either GPU. And now we're seeing 97 FPS versus 90, which is an 8% advantage to the 4060, although the 1% lows are actually advantage 6650 XT by 1 FPS, so 81 versus 80, 1% advantage. Not super significant there. But the medium settings are still looking pretty good here. If we move up to 1440p and we use the medium settings to try to keep performance and VRAM under control, both GPUs are actually offering an excellent native resolution 1440p experience here at 67 versus 63 FPS, so 6% lead for the 4060 and 4% advantage in the 1% lows at 59 versus 57. So this would be a pretty reasonable way to play the game at 1440p resolution. Let's move on to Cyberpunk. At 1080p ultra settings using the built-in benchmark, we see a 75 versus 71 FPS average advantage 4060 by 6%. However, the 1% lows are advantage 6650 XT by 6% at 57 versus 54, meaning maybe we could call this a tie, although honestly, I'd probably prefer higher 1% lows overall as experience goes, but they're pretty close anyway. But what about ray tracing? Well, neither of these GPUs are really cut out for the full path tracing RT overdrive mode, but if we try to kick on RT reflections on top of the 1080p Ultra settings, we do see the 4060 managing a 55 FPS, which is playable, although you might want higher, but that does give it a crushing 62% advantage over the 6650 XT, which is only averaging 34 FPS at those settings. If you use upscaling, which I, again, don't really love to do at 1080p, FSR and DLSS quality, I would say definite image quality advantage here to the DLSS image, and a performance advantage here for the 4060 by 48% at 86 versus 58 FPS, although the 6650 XT is at least putting up pretty playable frame rates now. It's definitely a better experience on the 4060, but I'm not sure getting those reflections is worth using upscaling at 1080p. If we move to 1440p Ultra settings, we're now seeing 45 FPS for the 4060 versus 41 for the 6650 XT, giving it a 10% advantage on the Nvidia GPU. And the 1% lows are a 6% advantage to the 4060 at 36 versus 34. However, this is a first-person shooter style game, so I think most people are going to be aiming for frame rates above the 40 FPS range. So one way to get there is to go down to the high settings. That brings the 4060 up to 55 FPS versus 49 on the 6650 XT, giving a 12% advantage to the Nvidia GPU at these settings, and a 7% lead in the 1% lows at 46 versus 43. And again, this is without having to upscale or anything like that. But again, we're still not over 60 FPS. It's a first-person shooter style game. But you could upscale at 1440p, have it look pretty reasonable. However, I would give the image quality edge here to DLSS. I think you can see a lot more shimmering in the FSR side of the screen if you look at the fine details. It's also an 18% performance advantage to the 4060 at 87 versus 74 in the averages and 68 versus 61 in the 1% lows, which is an 11% advantage for those 1% lows. Let's go ahead and move on to Starfield, which at 1080p Ultra settings gives a 10% advantage to the RTX 4060 at 43 versus 39 FPS. And they're tied in the 1% lows at 33. Well, this is certainly playable, and other areas of the game that aren't in one of the city environments like New Atlantis that I'm testing here do perform better. This probably isn't the frame rates you're really chasing in a game with first-person shooter style combat. So if we go down to medium settings, performance bumps up significantly, although especially so on the RTX 4060, which is hitting 70 FPS now, as opposed to 58 FPS on the 6650 XT, giving a 21% advantage to the RTX 4060 at these settings, although both GPUs are definitely playable here. The 1% lows are 53 versus 50, which is a lot closer together, but a 6% advantage for the 4060. If we move up to 1440p Ultra settings, neither GPU is doing great at 34 versus 32 FPS. That's a 6% advantage to the 4060. And in the 1% lows, we're at a 4% advantage for the 4060 at 28 versus 27. But again, we're down in the 30s here, and the 1% lows are below 30, so probably not the settings you're going to actually play at. So what if we tried out medium settings? If we play 1440p medium settings, this gives us a 16% advantage to the 4060. So once again, the medium settings seem to be more favorable for the Nvidia GPU here relative to the AMD GPU for whatever reason. And we're seeing a 52 versus 45 FPS average here. The 1% lows are 40 versus 39, so only a 3% lead there. But again, still might not be the frame rates you were looking for in this style of game. So if we then upscale off of the medium settings, and I really hate the low settings in this game, so I definitely upscale at medium rather than go down to low. Here we're seeing 71 FPS versus 56, and the 4060 is extending its lead to 27%, which is pretty interesting here, especially since I would give the image quality advantage to DLSS. But let's go ahead and test out some other games. What about Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which uses ray tracing at all times, and therefore I was expecting to see a larger advantage for the RTX 4060. However, that's not what I'm measuring. I mean, it is advantage 4060, but only by 5% at 1080p Ultra settings at 41 FPS versus 39, 10% lead in the 1% lows, which is a bit more significant. But again, those aren't really the frame rates you'd be looking for in a game with first-person shooter style combat. So if we enable DLSS and FSR upscaling at the quality setting, we do get close to 60 FPS on both GPUs, and the 4060 extends its lead to 13% at 63 FPS versus 56, and the 1% lows are a more noticeable lead at 49 versus 39, which is actually a 26% advantage for the RTX 4060 here. However, if you don't love upscaling at 1080p, we could just choose the medium settings and leave it at native 1080p resolution. That actually ties the average FPS at 61. However, the 1% lows are a 16% lead for the 4060 at 50 versus 43. But certainly not some of the massive ray tracing advantages that we saw, for example, using RT reflections in Cyberpunk. If we move to 1440p medium settings, both GPUs are actually exactly tied in both the averages and in the 1% lows. They're both hitting 41 FPS average in this scene and 36 in the 1% lows. However, 41 FPS average probably isn't what you're looking for here. So 1440p medium settings, probably not what we're actually going to do. More likely kick on FSR and or DLSS quality. And here again, I would give image quality advantage to DLSS. If you look at things like the fence line at the top of the base, I think the image is a lot more stable in the DLSS side of things. And we're hitting a 17% performance advantage for the 4060 as well at 68 versus 58 FPS, but both GPUs are definitely now playable, and the 1% lows are also a 17% advantage for the RTX 4060. Speaking of 1% lows advantages, that's what we're seeing in Alan Wake 2. This is common on a lot of the AMD graphics cards I've tested in this area of Alan Wake 2 that I use for benchmarking, where the 1% lows, the frame pacing, look at the frame time graph, just gets these big spikes. It's a little bit stuttery, and at 1080p high settings, 4060 has a 10% advantage in the averages, but a 52% lead in the 1% lows. If we use FSR and DLSS quality at 1080p high, averages are basically tied at 61 and 62 respectively, and they're averaging 60 FPS. However, I'd give an image quality advantage to DLSS, although I'd honestly rather not upscale on either of them. And the 1% lows are a more noticeable 26% advantage for the 4060 at 44 versus 35. If we move down to low settings and don't upscale, again, the averages aren't too far apart at 56 versus 52, which is an 8% lead for the 4060. But the 1% lows, and look at the spiky frame time graph on the left-hand side of the screen indicating unstable frame pacing. 1% lows are a bit of an issue on the 6650 XT at 19 versus 42 on the RTX 4060. If we go ahead and try to use ray tracing in this game, since it's one of Nvidia's ray tracing showcases, we don't really get a great experience on either GPU, and even using quality level upscaling at 1080p, which again I'd rather avoid, and only using the low ray tracing settings, even the 4060 is only hitting a 37 FPS average with 1% lows below 30 at 27. However, that is significantly better than the 6650 XT, but I really don't think these are the settings you would use on either GPU. At 1440p, even at low settings, we're only hitting 39 and 34 FPS respectively, which is a 15% advantage of the 4060. And once again, we're seeing that spiky frame time graph for the 6650 XT, giving an 88% lead in the 1% lows at 30 versus 16. Not that the 4060 itself is, hitting amazing frame rates at these settings. So we could use upscaling off of the low settings at the quality level, FSR versus DLSS, usual thoughts on image quality apply. And here we're seeing the averages at 58 versus 56. So everything seems fine until you look at the spiky frame time graph and the 1% lows on the 6650 XT, where the 4060 is doubling the 1% lows at 42 versus 21. So Alan Wake 2 doesn't have the greatest frame times. Neither does Resident Evil 4 on either GPU, where even though at max settings, it uses more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And that means that that both GPUs have massive spikes on the frame time graphs, leading to 1% lows at 10 FPS. So despite the averages being higher on the 4060, it's kind of irrelevant because this would be a stuttery way to play the game on either GPU. So switching the settings to prioritize graphics would be a much better idea. And this brings the performance much closer together and much better overall. They both have smooth frame time graphs. The 4060 is 8% ahead at 110 FPS average versus 102. And the 1% lows are only 4% apart, with the 4060 leading at 98 FPS versus 94. So very good experience at these settings on both graphics cards. If we move up to 1440p at max settings, again, surprise, surprise, massive stutters on the frame time graph on both graphics cards, so you can kind of ignore the fact that the 4060 is winning because you just wouldn't use these settings with single-digit 1% lows and those big spikes and stutters on the frame time graph. So basically, 8GB graphics cards just can't handle the max settings in this game, and that's all we learned from that. If we move on to the prioritize graphics preset at 1440p, now our 8GB graphics cards are completely fine, and our performance is basically tied, actually tiny advantage to the 6650 XT at 73 FPS versus 72 average, which is a 1% lead, and a 3% lead in the 1% lows at a 67 versus 65. So very even performance in this game at the settings you would probably actually use. Now, if we take a look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p with basic preset to get the overall performance numbers up for a competitive online game, we're actually seeing the 6650 XT take a 16% lead in the averages at 198 versus 171, and a 21% lead in the 1% lows at 130 versus 107. So actually one of the more noticeable wins for the 6650 XT, which has been behind in most of the testing today. If we move up to 1440p basic settings, the 6650 XT actually still has a lead, although it drops a little bit compared to what it had at 1080p. It's taking a 13% advantage in the averages at 139 versus 123, and an 18% lead in the 1% lows at 84 versus 71. So a pretty good showing for AMD in this title. Now, that's all the tests I ran for today's video, which was quite a bit, with a lot of games at a lot of settings and a couple of different resolutions and upscaling and all that. And what did we learn? I think we definitely learned that the RTX 4060 is the better graphics card. If you were offered both graphics cards at the same price, or somebody was like, here, pick one, you can have them for free, which one do you want? You would definitely choose the RTX 4060. It's usually a little bit ahead. Occasionally it's behind, like we saw in Call of Duty here. So, if you have particular games you focus on, definitely take that into consideration. Again, we saw some small leads for the 6650 XT and Ghost of Tsushima. But generally, if we look at those percentage differences, it's more frequently a ranging from like a small 5% lead to more like, in some cases, more like a 15% lead, rarely going beyond that for the 4060, although there's a few exceptions, and definitely in some situations they're basically tied. The ray tracing performance difference I found to be not particularly meaningful, since at a lot of ray tracing settings, there's either not that massive of a difference, or sometimes they're even 6650 XT is even hanging in there. But also in some games where the ray tracing differential is larger, the overall performance numbers, like in Alan Wake 2, are so low that you probably wouldn't be using those settings on the 4060. So I don't find the ray tracing selling point that big of a deal here. However, I do think that DLSS versus FSR is definitely something to think about. And I think that that's especially going to matter at 1440p, where there's definitely games where you have to use upscaling even on the low settings if you're wanting to play around 60 frames per second. So that kind of brings me to my overall thoughts here, which is that, again, 4060 is definitely better, and it's more noticeable at 1440p resolution, where at this kind of performance class, you're likely to be using upscaling now, and even more so in the future. That being said, there's a large price differential. These cards don't cost the same. $275 versus about $220. That's what, $55 increase. And when we're talking about GPUs in this price class, $55 is a pretty big price difference. So I guess what I'd say is, if it's gonna be really hard for you to stretch your budget past $200, the 6650 XT certainly offers better value than the 4060. It doesn't offer better overall performance, nor does it offer a better feature set, but it offers close to the same performance, good enough performance for 1080p, and even good enough performance for 1440p if you're going to use some upscaling. Although, you know, FSR upscaling versus DLSS, losing out a bit there on the image quality, but you're getting the same performance class. And again, saving a lot of money to get there. So I think this really stands out as if somebody is really stretching to go beyond $200. The 6650 XT delivers something very close to what you get from the RTX 4060. Which again, I would put into more of the $300 GPU price class. And if you were trying to stretch your budget close to the $300 price point, the 6750 XT from AMD comes in with 12 gigabytes of VRAM and a lot more performance, coming in at $290. So you can check out my coverage of the 6700 XT versus the RTX 4060, because those are more price class competitors. Today's video was more about what kind of performance do you lose by just saving the $55 and getting that 6650 XT compared to that 4060? And I think we saw that it did come in offering a similar experience in most games, although certainly the 4060 is better. So that's what I've got for you guys today. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially. That's such a huge help, and it's amazing that you guys are willing to do that for me. Totally understand that not everybody's in a financial position to do that, which is fine, but as a thank you to channel members who have clicked the join button, you get membership badges on your comments. Your comments are easier to find because the YouTube Studio for creators filters those out and kind of highlights them for us. Also, I post a lot of videos as early access for channel members, and even some behind the scenes videos which don't even make sense for the overall channel also end up being up there for channel members if you kind of want some behind the scenes information on how things are going around here, future plans, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so massive thank you to channel members for clicking that join button, but I hope everyone has an excellent day.